how I've set it up, and you'll see in a minute, is if there's either no physics material or if there's one called dirt, it will use the dirt sound effect. And then we've got metal, water, and water works a little bit differently. Water is based on whether or not the player's feet are underwater, so it doesn't use physics materials for that. And I think that's it. So we'll take a look at Fmod first, and I'll talk a bit about why I like Fmod so much, kind of along the way as well. And if you've ever done this sort of stuff, you know, you've probably, assuming you're not using something like Fmod, assuming you're just using Unity's built-in audio engine, you've probably kept like an array or a list of footstep sounds. I guess multiple arrays, right? Because you'd say have material A and then a list of sounds, material B, and so on and so forth. What I really like about Fmod is that's kind of built right in. So the ability to round robin, pick from a set of samples, and then basically build kind of what's like a sheet of different things, different sounds, different whatever. So you can see here, all natively through Fmod, I've got, you know, index here defined as dirt, metal, wood, so on and so forth. Right, totally configurable using parameters. And each one gets a corresponding value. So dirt is 0, metal is 1, and so on and so forth. And so what that does then, that exposes in Unity a parameter called index, and we just pass through the corresponding value. So this is kind of how things started off. So a good number of samples, so fairly realistic in that regard. And then the water sound effects. So that's basically all I had for the longest time, probably, I don't know, about a year or so. And so now you can see I've added metal. Wood. And concrete. And the other thing I've done here as well, and this again has been in place since I integrated Fmod, is I've exposed a velocity parameter, which basically, depending on how fast you're moving, so if you're kind of crawling versus walking versus running, I'll just pass through a different value. And that basically just modulates the, you can actually see it happening right there, the volume of this channel. So that would be crawling, that would probably be walking, and then running. One thing I did recently when I was revisiting this and adding the additional sound effects is I've split water out into its own track. And the reason is I don't want that scaling, because you can't run in the water. You can basically only crawl or walk. And I figure, oh, the cat's here. He likes to dominate my chair, and he likes to do it especially when I'm streaming. Like, he knows. But so far I've been able to keep it to myself. So he may start stabbing me with his claws, but hopefully not. So water, though, I'm thinking it doesn't really make sense to modulate the volume of that, because I mean, if you're in water, water is loud. Probably not going to be a whole lot more quiet if you're crawling in it versus walking in it. So basically, ignores that velocity entirely. So no modulation on that. While I was at it as well, I also took the opportunity to do the same for the landing sound effects. So you can see here, same idea. And I think I didn't actually have any material support for this one, so there was no water, for example. If I recall correctly, there was no sound effect playing, or maybe it was playing the dirt one when you landed in water, which is a bit weird. So pretty happy with that. So let's we'll walk around a little bit. We'll look at some code. Feel free to ask any questions as well if you're curious about anything specific here. But yeah, really happy with how this turned out, and the extra ambience that it creates. Right, it's a small thing, but like I think about, you know, really immersive games. One of my favorite for sound design, definitely Bloodborne, and the Souls series in general. And like, you just think, even just kind of walking through, you know, you walk into a new room, a new area. You know, there's a nice kind of background ambience going on. Maybe the reverb changes a bit, and you know, really matches the shape of the space and the materials. And it's just, yeah, just that alone, like just hearing the footsteps and the, you know, the clanging and that kind of stuff of your weapons and stuff. I love that kind of stuff. So let's kind of run around, walk around here. So you saw mud in Fmod as one of the surfaces, and so probably that's going to be mostly for gore stuff like this. I love that stuff. You know, you just kind of walk through this disgusting pile of oozy gore. And then we got water with the landing sound there. One little quirk I have now, and it's, I mean, it's a bug, but it's not a bad thing necessarily, is when you crouch, because I basically just instantly reduce the height of the character, it kind of falls, so it ends up triggering the landing sound effects, which kind of makes sense if you were to abruptly sort of crouch, so I may leave it like that. We got wood, dirt, and landing sound for all those. One thing I'm debating is the power slide. So this is basically if you run and then crouch, it's to be used for entering little tunnels like this. It's currently using a dirt sort of gravelly sound. I'm debating if I take the time to do versions for all the different materials. And the reason I'm debating that is because it's meant for going into tunnels, and the tunnels are typically dirt anyway. So like it's not really meant for doing that. You could, but there's no real reason. So I'm on the fence. That was a custom sound that I kind of built through sort of merging a bunch of shorter slidey gravel sounds. So it take a bit of work to do it for each different surface, just because the sample pack I'm using doesn't have one that long, so I have to kind of assemble it myself. So we'll see. Pretty minor thing, but I can't really stop the player from doing this. It would be weird and complicated because you basically initiate it when you're near a tunnel like this, right? So we'll see. So that's kind of how it's sounding. We'll flip over to the code here. And so what I've done for my controller, it's a modified version of the Unity first-person controller that I've just been kind of making my own, adding stuff like crouching and running was there, but I think I've got, yeah, there's some climbing stuff in here. There's all the audio is now converted to use Fmod events. And so basically when I trigger the footstep in play footstep audio, so this was just a core method that was in the base first-person controller. But now I'll basically set the parameter, the index parameter, based on, let's see, where are you? Based on this function that I've created here called getMaterialIndex, and that takes a material name, which I grab from basically an update, or in late update in my case. And again, this is just out of the base first-person controller logic. It does a, let's see, does a sphere cast, project on plane. And so from the sphere cast, there's a hit info. And so I've just gone a bit further. It's just used for doing some movement logic, but I've now I now grab the material as well if there's a collider. I found some cases where there wasn't a collider, which is a bit odd. I don't know what it's hitting if it's not if it doesn't have a collider, but then take that, and I've just exposed this as a, well, as a public, but really it could be private. I think that was just for debugging that it's public. And had to do a little kind of kludgy thing here, just because of the way these materials become instances of things. So in their name, it actually says instance. So I've had to just strip that out. And then basically if it's metal, if it's wood, so on and so forth, and just map those to the Fmod values. So if I end up doing, like, you know, maybe there's a reason to have, say, a separate mud material or whatever, but I'm just going to try to keep it to these four for now. I don't think there's any performance implications of doing this. Because I mean, behind the scenes, I believe in Unity there's just a default physics material used anyway, and so the upside of this is kind of twofold. One, now I can do the multi-surface footsteps, but two, I can tweak the physics material parameters to actually reflect that that material, right? Because metal is going to behave different than wood, than concrete, and mud or gore as well. So now, if like stuff is falling on the surfaces, it'll respond a bit differently in terms of friction and bounce and that kind of stuff, versus just everything kind of behaving exactly the same. So that's good. The one thing I haven't done yet, and this will be a little bit of work, but I'm just gonna kind of pick away at it as I go through this, is I've only set up the physics materials in my test scene, so I have to go back through a number of prefabs and start setting up those materials. The nice thing is everything just defaults to dirt, and dirt is probably the most common, because all just the basic floors are dirt. So that's a bit about that. And then the landing sound, I mean, just basically the same idea, right? Set the parameter. You can see the velocity logic there. So next up, I'll enable this game object here that has a number of the ghost enemies. So you can see they're kind of these floating skulls, and they're kind of like the Boo enemy from Mario in that if you're looking at them, specifically if you're pointing your flashlight at them, they'll kind of recoil. Otherwise, they'll sneak up on you. And what I've done now, I've added a sort of flashback kind of effect here that we'll take a look at. And along with that, I've improved the sound effects. Kind of the sort of backward, creepy talking stuff. And what I like is these guys can kind of go through walls to wherever, basically. So you'll be like, you'll just kind of hear them like in the distance, not be able to see them, and they'll just like come out of the wall and charge you. Now they don't do too much damage, which is good, because that would be a little bit cheap, right? If they could take a big hit out of your damage, out of your health rather, and then when you point your flashlight at them, they'll just kind of take off for a bit. So we'll do a little rundown of how that was set up. Let's probably flip back to Photoshop here, I think, for that. We'll take a look at the old miner sheet. So you can see basically it's basically a sprite sheet that I've done here. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, I think. And each one I've done a little bit of processing to add that kind of ghostly sort of wavy animation to on top of the faces. And that was a suggestion from someone on the devlog. You know, he thought it maybe wasn't the most respectful thing to have, because these are real like archival pictures, right? He thought it maybe wasn't the most respectful to actually show their faces. So I took some time to kind of blur them out. Actually, if we look at, let's look at the source PSD for this, if I can remember where I put that. I think it's this one. So this was kind of pass one of this, where I just went through and I think those are just, yeah, the individual frames. Basically just went through and with a mask, just kind of whited them out, which is already, you know, a little bit creepy on some of them, kind of this glowing sort of face. But then I took that and then basically applied a ripple type effect. And so you end up with this, you know, these subtle differences between each one that creates this kind of flamey sort of effect. So I'm pretty happy with that as well. And I think, yeah, I did add a subtle bit of noise. I could bump it up a bit, because what I want is I want you to see the noise artifacts with each frame as well. And don't quite right now because it's a bit too subtle, so I may try that at some point. And then how this actually works in-game is we've got on the player, so it's actually based on the damage effects. Let's see, where are you? It's here. See if we can trigger the damage effects first. Right, so whenever you take damage, I just spawn some particles. It's basically right in front of the camera. So I've taken this as the basis for the terror effects. It's the same idea. Right. And now what I'm doing, I'm using the texture sheet animation option of the particle system here. And so I pick a random row, and then I just play 2 cycles through it. And I've got a little, I've got some rotation over time to just kind of tilt it a bit, and some size over time as well to zoom it in and out a little bit. So I think that's turned out pretty well. One thing I did along the way in the process of doing this as well is I've added now an additional type of damage. Let me just think where the best place to look for this is. I think it's in player. Yeah, so I've got this enum damage type. And so previously I had unspecified, which would be the general damage, blunt, and environmental, which will be, I think, currently used for smoke. Maybe water as well, like if you're underwater for a certain amount of time. So I've added terror to that list as well. And so now when the player gets hit, if the type is terror, then we play 1 particle. And so now that I've done that, I can do some cool stuff like if you take toxic damage, for example, like if you're walking in a pile of toxic waste, I can maybe spawn different particles, not the bloody ones, but some bright green, sort of toxic looking ones. And then from there, I was thinking I might even look at having a toxic type status effect. So maybe if you take toxic damage for a certain amount of time, meter builds up, and then you get some status effect, like maybe your stamina regen, stops or reduces or something like that. So that's a bit about that. And then the last thing we'll look at here is the ghost sounds. So I wasn't totally happy. So what I had before was just a sort of hissing kind of thing. I think I actually ripped that from Operation Hardcore. But first of all, I didn't like that it was the same sound playing. And it's also kind of abrasive. So if you had a few ghosts around you, just hear that same sound over and over. So what I've done instead is I've taken this fairly long, it's about a minute and 32. Just kind of backwards talking, creepy sort of voices. And to break it up, and this is another reason I love Fmod, is I've just randomized the start offset. So it'll just start playing at a random spot between basically 0 and 83%. So somewhere, I don't know, over here maybe. And so you can see actually as I trigger this, you can see it's starting like over here, starting there, starting there, and so on and so forth. And so between that and the volume envelope, which you don't unfortunately hear in the preview here, but if we switch over to sandbox view, I think it's this one. So I fade in and fade out. So you don't end up with any like pops or clicks or abrupt artifacts. You just get a nice smooth fade in, fade out. So I'm quite happy with that. It seems, maybe this is just random, but it seems kind of biased towards the start Because you saw there, like 3 times in a row, it was playing, you know, like 0 or 1% into the sample, which is a bit weird. But something else I should mention as well for anyone who's using Fmod, something I ran into. So I upgraded to, as part of this, I upgraded to Fmod 2 from Fmod 1, which did require some code changes. Actually, they removed, I think it was. Set parameter by name. That used to be called set parameter by ID or something like that, or set parameter. Can't remember exactly, but I had to go through and anywhere I was setting parameters, basically switch over to this method. Other than that, it wasn't too bad. But there was one thing that I was really annoyed with initially, and that was that Fmod, the plugin, was scanning my banks like every 5 seconds or something ridiculous. So you'd be trying to use the editor, and it would just kind of lock up, scan the files, work for 5 seconds, lock up. And that's a bug in the integration that will be fixed in the next version. But what I've done for now, let's just see if we can find that. Yeah, I think it was this one. So this helpful user here. So they do have a fix for it, I think, now in GitHub, which you can just grab directly. But this user here just basically gave a few lines of code. And so I just commented those out just to basically stop that polling from happening. And so now I think it will still pull at certain points, or I can just go fmod refresh banks if I make any changes. So slightly annoying, but not a huge deal in the grand scheme of things, but just something to watch out for if you happen to be using this version or plan on using it imminently. So that's about it for TOXICANT. So next steps there, basically getting all the materials applied to the actual prefabs in the actual game and out of this test scene. The ghost stuff's pretty much done and working. I might make them a bit more aggressive. I found they're pretty easy to avoid in-game. So I might either speed up their charge speed or reduce the distance, the threshold for them recoiling from the flashlight, just to make them a bit more, you know, because it's not, like I said earlier, it's not, they don't do that much damage. I think it's damage per second, and it ends up being, unless you kind of manage to just stand in them, it ends up being like a couple hit points, basically, like a couple % of your health. I might switch that to instant damage at some point, which I've done for especially the things that hurt you a lot, like when the main mutant miner guys swipe at you. It now does, I think, like 25, or I think it might be 25. So basically you can take 2 hits when you spawn. You spawn with 50% of your health. So I might do something like that and just set it to like 5% or something like that. But we'll see. It feels okay right now. It's more about the ambience that it creates.